Welcome to Podcast on the Brink, your weekly dose of Indiana basketball news and discussion, brought to you by the Assembly Call and Inside the Hall. I'm your host, Jerod Morris. Join me live at assemblycall.com every Thursday night and immediately following every IU game for our live IU postgame show. And visit InsideTheHall.com for complete coverage of IU basketball and to join the discussion in the Inside the Hall Premium Forum. On this week's edition of Podcast on the Brink, I'm here, Alex Bozich in here, and our special guest, Bill Murphy, is here. A walking encyclopedia of the history of Indiana basketball. He's written several books, Branch, The Cardiac Kids, which is a football book. He's written some football books as well. But there's really no one better to talk to about our project, the greatest IU basketball player of all time, than Bill. He actually helped me with the seeding, because when I was thinking, who do I need to talk to make sure I'm not leaving out anybody obvious or that there aren't any just gross mistakes with seeding, let me talk to Bill, because he will know. I mean, he can speak extemporaneously about any IU team, any player, any era. It is truly incredible. So he is here with us to break down the four regions, to talk about some of the surprising results from the first round, what we think might happen with some of the interesting matchups coming up in the second round. It's just a fun conversation, and really it's just a big elaborate excuse to talk IU basketball and to talk about some of these stories of old IU players that don't get talked about a lot. And so that's what we do in this episode of Podcast on the Brink. Before we get to that, I do want to remind you guys to go to homefieldapparel.com, support our friends at homefieldapparel.com. Obviously, this is a really tough time for all small businesses, and people, small businesses, everybody kind of shows their true colors when the chips are down, and I think Home Field Apparel is really doing that. They're a relatively young small business. It's and I've obviously been selling a lot of shirts, and they're doing very well, but they're not rolling and with just a massive endowment of cash, but they have committed to their employees, and said they're offering paid sick leave, and they're gonna give full-time pay even if they have to cut back hours because their operations aren't going to be full. And when you see a company that does right by their employees, by the people, that they value people over profits, that's the kind of small business that we want to support. And so that's why, even though they're not paying us for these ads right now, we are still running them because we love the guys at homefieldapparel.com. And even more important, for an apparel company, is their stuff is great. It's really comfortable. They've got some of the most unique IU logos that you will find anywhere. So go to homefieldapparel.com, shop for yourself, shop for friends, shop for family members, any Indiana fan that you know. If you're not going to buy them something from homefieldapparel.com, send them the link and recommend homefieldapparel.com to them. And let them know that if they use the promo code BRINK, BRINK, they will get 20% off their entire order at homefieldapparel.com. All right. Let's bring in Bill Murphy. Let's talk some Indiana basketball history. Here we go. Okay, well, we are joined this week on Podcast on the Brink by a very special guest who is going to help us go through the greatest Indiana basketball player of all time tournament that we currently have going at InsideTheHall.com. The first round voting is over, so we wanted to break that down and look ahead to what's going to happen there in the ensuing rounds. And so here with us to talk about that is Bill Murphy. He is an author of 4 books about Indiana basketball and football, including Branch, including The Cardiac Kids, both of which are right over here on my bookshelf as we talk. He's also a contributor over at Hoosiers United, and easily, without a doubt, one of the most knowledgeable people about the history of Indiana basketball on the planet, which is why we had to bring you on this week to talk, Bill. So thank you for being here with us.
Thank you very much. That's very nice of you, Jerod.
Absolutely. No, I've always really enjoyed our chats about Indiana basketball. I think one time we had an hour-and-a-half long chat about the 1960 team, and you filled me in about every detail of that great season. So you are literally a walking encyclopedia of IU knowledge. So it'll be fun to break this down with you. So
the tournament was great that you've put together. It's a lot of fun.
Well, thank you. Yeah, we figured this would be a nice, fun diversion with, the new basketball being taken away from us this March. And so, Alex, maybe we'll start real quick just by kind of resetting, because maybe some people haven't seen this, but if you go to InsideTheHall.com, you'll see a series of posts, that have the greatest Indiana basketball player of all time in the subject line. And basically, we put together a 68-person tournament. Seeded everybody with playing games. We decided to break it into 4 regions, and we did the regions based on era. So there's the pre-night era region, and then 2 regions that span Bob Knight's tenure. One is Bob Knight before 1985, the other Bob Knight post-85, and then the post-Knight tenure. And we didn't really necessarily set out to do it that way with everything revolving around Bob Knight, but it really actually made sense when you break up the great players in history. Those lines really do work to kind of be able to include everybody who should be in something like this. So we figured out the best, 16, 17 players from each region, seeded them all, and now voting is being done on the Inside the Hall website. Votes are being submitted by Twitter. So certainly there's a little bit of a selection bias there with people who are on Twitter doing the voting, and we fully acknowledge that. And Alex, we set out, the biggest challenge with something like this is what's the criteria? Because you could do who's the best individual player, where every matchup is like who would win one-on-one, or, who produced the most, or, who's the greatest winner, who had the best overall career, including, NBA. Like, you could go a number of different ways. We tried to set it up as kind of a hybrid, and that's how we coached people on the post, which was, it's a combination of just how good were they as a player, what was their impact on winning? What was their overall impact on the culture of Indiana basketball? And, so kind of for it to be a holistic view where you could have a debate between, say, a Jordan Hulls and an Eric Gordon, where even though we know Eric Gordon is the better player, Jordan Hulls' teams did more. He was here for 4 years. That should be given, a certain amount of weight over a guy who was only here one. And then obviously it was up to every individual person to do that. So that's kind of the setup here. And so if you haven't seen the bracket, you can go to InsideTheHall.com and see it. What's the response been so far, Alex, since we put it out there?
Well, there's a lot kind of to unpack and talk about here. First, I first want to acknowledge the work that was done on a background perspective by you on this, because, this, while Inside the Hall is right now hosting this, myself personally had very little to do with the seeding of the bracket, the background. So kudos to you on that. And
this is Alex's way of thanking me, but also removing himself from any criticism of seedings.
No.
I'm kidding. I'm messing with you.
But I also want to say that Dylan Wallace and Cam Drummond, our two student writers, have done a tremendous amount of work in terms of all of the capsules for the players, all that's appearing in every post. So I can't take credit for much of anything other than hitting publish on the posts. With that said, I do want to address a couple of things feedback that we've gotten, specifically in the forum when we first posted about this. And Jerod, I think you saw some of this, was, why is a certain player a 2 seed, a 3 seed? How were the matchups done? The reason that we wanted to, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is why I understand that we split it up the way we did, is that we didn't want the players that were pre-night to be not represented in the later rounds of this tournament. And yes, I think what would have happened if we would have done that, there may have been a few names that would have snuck through maybe to the round of 32 or the Sweet 16, but ultimately there would have been no representation for that era of IU basketball in the later rounds. And so, to be fair, some of the regions may be more stacked than others based on the time period of IU basketball, but we also wanted to be respectful of the fact that there was great basketball played at IU before Bob Knight, and we also wanted to have representation of the post-Knight era, which, there's been some great players in Bloomington since then. So, there's no perfect way to do this. There's no perfect criteria. One thing I've noticed in some of the responses that I've gotten is, for example, how can you mentioned the Eric Gordon, Jordan Hulls debate. Well, a lot of this is in the eye of the beholder. What do you value the most? If you're going to look and say, what did a guy do after he left IU? Of course, George McGinnis, who, was one of the upset winners in the first round based on seeding. Of course, he went on to a great career, but what did he actually do at IU, and what is his lasting legacy at the program? And so there's no perfect way to do this, but I feel like overall the response has been very positive, and it's been, I think a terrific exercise in a time right now where there's a lot of people missing basketball, something fun for us all to think about and debate. And unfortunately, since I post the polls, I can't vote in any of them. So my voice is on the sideline. Jerod, I'm sure you have the ability to vote since you're able to. So it's going to be I think fascinating here to see the Sweet 16 rounds. Not maybe the round of 32. There may not be a ton of suspense, but I think once we get deeper into the tournament, there's going to be a lot closer matchups because some of the ones so far have been so one-sided. There's been 95+% winners, and so that doesn't add a lot of suspense or anything. But I think the deeper we get, the more fun it's going to get.
Oh yeah. Oh, just these. There's some really epic round of 32 battles, which we'll talk about. And the last thing I want to say, just kind of as preamble here, is just to thank Bill because, Bill, as I was putting this together, you were the guy that I went to basically say, hey, Bill, will you check my work, make sure I didn't forget anybody obvious, and then we debated, who should be kind of in those 15, 16, seeds at the back end, didn't want to leave anybody out. So thank you for doing that because that really helped me avoid some critical seeding errors that I would have made without your assistance. So thank you.
Well, you're welcome. I have to say, I thought that the way you set it up with the pre-night era, and I probably am going to I will agree with Alex in the fact that the demographic of people that vote on Twitter are probably not going to have, for the most part, a great knowledge of that pre-night era. And when I looked at it, I thought there were great matchups in the pre-night era. I mean, I thought there were fantastic matchups. And Alex, I did vote on each one. In fact, I've already sent Jerod the entire round. He knows who's the winner and who came runner-up and everything in my poll. So I thought it was a real good idea.
So let's go through some, before we look ahead to the round of 32 matchups, let's look at some of the close and or controversial matchups from the first round. We'll start there in the pre-night era. And I want to start, Bill, right off the bat with the result that I disliked the most from the first round and that made me regret the seeding choices, which is number 5 seed Bill Garrett against number 12 seed George McGinnis, which George McGinnis won 64% to 36%. I don't think anybody would argue that Bill Garrett was a better player than George McGinnis. Again, if those two played one-on-one, George McGinnis would win. He put together one of the great individual statistical seasons in Indiana history. And yet for what Bill Garrett meant, he left school as the all-time leading scorer at Indiana. He was obviously, the guy who helped to integrate college basketball. He wasn't the first African-American player to appear in a game, but he was the first one to start and play regularly. And just everything he meant, everything he did. I was hopeful that he would keep going in the tournament because I always look for any excuse to tell his story. But the people voting for this obviously valued the individual just dominance of George McGinnis. And so every tournament needs a 12-5 upset, and we got ours with George McGinnis beating Bill Garrett.
You want me to comment on that particular
one?
Oh,
yes,
now?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. I'm chomping at the bit here to do that. So, the way I see this whole tournament, when you're voting, is that the individual has to come up with what are their parameters in voting. And being a former history teacher and Indiana basketball historian, I looked at more than just what they did on the basketball court. Now, yes, George, and I love George. I really do. His 29.9 points a game, all-time record at IU for averaging most points in a game. His 14.7 rebounds in 1 year. He led the Big Ten in both scoring and rebounding that 1 year that he played at IU. You cannot ignore how great of a player he was. And in fact, he scored over 40 points twice, once 45, once 41 in a game. So you have that. But then on the other side, you have Bill Garrett and what he meant for the whole culture, not only of IU basketball, but Big Ten basketball. As Jerod said, he wasn't the first African-American to play, but he was the first African-American starter and regular player. And you had a guy that left IU not only as the IU leading scorer career-wise, but as the Big Ten leading scorer career-wise. He would be the last 6'2" All-American center ever in the United States. He would go on, his teams would finish second in the Big Ten and did very, very, very well. I mean, his breaking the color barrier in the Big Ten, what he and Branch did is unbelievably awesome. And so when I voted, I voted Bill in because I thought his impact on the whole program was greater than George's impact the 1 year that he played. Garrett had 3 years, George had 1 year. What a lot of people don't know, and this is going away from IU a little bit, but he's the only Mr. Basketball to not only win a state championship as a high school player, but to coach and win a state championship as a coach. And he did that with Indianapolis Crispus Attucks. So his
that's Bill Garrett that you're talking about.
Right. Yeah. Bill Garrett. Yeah. Bill Garrett did all of that. So his impact on Indiana basketball cannot be denied. It really can't. So in my opinion, Bill Garrett, as great as George's 1 year was, his impact was not what Bill Garrett's was. And yes, Bill Garrett didn't play professionally in the NBA, but that was only because he was drafted by the Celtics, but he was also drafted by Uncle Sam. And he went off to serve in the military for a couple of years. When he came back, by that point, the Celtics had cut him. He would go and play a very short time with the Harlem Globetrotters, and then he would go into coaching. And then, unfortunately, die very early from a heart attack, very early in his life. He died a very young man. But his impact on IU basketball is forever embedded in the history of IU.
Mm-hmm. But Bill, when you look ahead to the round of 32, and I've got the bracket here right in front of me of the voting for for the pre-night era, we're talking specifically, there's going to be 4 matchups, obviously, in that round of 32. Which of these matchups is most intriguing to you? We've got Don Schlunt versus Jimmy Rail. We've got, obviously, Big George against Branch McCracken. Slick Leonard and Archie Dees going head-to-head, and then we also have Everett Dean and Walt Bellamy. Of those 4, which to you is the most intriguing?
Well, okay, I'm going to start off with saying that Schlunt is a slam dunk. I mean, that's easy. Archie Dees, truthfully, is a slam dunk to me as well. And I love watching Bobby Leonard play, and I did see Bobby Leonard play at IU. I loved watching him play, but Archie was the first 2-time MVP in the Big Ten ever, and one of just a very few IU players who averaged 20 points for his career. And then you have
watch out for that one though, because Slick Leonard does have the name recognition. So there's upset potential there based on the voting.
No, don't get me wrong. I'm just saying what I think. I know there's plenty of. I mean, Slick's been around forever.
Yeah.
So he has a very good chance of winning that. The McGinnis McCracken will be interesting because again, you're going to have a guy that will have the stats far and away. But of course, you're looking at different eras of playing. I mean, when Branch played, he was one of few players on the court that actually shot a one-handed shot and wasn't shooting underhand. So you have that going for you. And Branch was an All-American in 1930. In 1928, we won a Big Ten title with Branch. Obviously, I'm going to have a little bias here because I wrote his biography. So I have to. So let's just put that on the table right up front. But Branch would coach 24 years at IU, win 4 Big Ten titles, 2 national championships, and I have chronicled Branch and Knight's coaching careers are like a mirror. I mean, it's unbelievable how close they are, and I can go into that later too. But I think when you look at, again, the impact on IU basketball, you're looking at a guy who 24 years coached, 3 years played versus a guy that played 1 year, one exceptional year. So I have Branch moving on in that one. And then the other one that's really intriguing, Alex and Jerod, is Dean versus Bellamy. And my son and I just finished this conversation. He lives out in L.A. We just finished this conversation last night because he told me I was crazy. And that's not the first time he's told me that. But I have Dean advancing over Bellamy. And
Whoa.
I have to say, I know. And I have to say, if people say, who are your top 5 all-time favorite players at IU, Walt's one of them, because I loved Walt Bellamy. I loved watching him play. He was so entertaining. And I can go on and talk about what a great player he was, not only at IU, but in the NBA. In fact, a lot of people don't know he averaged 31 points his rookie year and 19 rebounds, and the only person in the NBA to ever have a better rookie year was Wilt Chamberlain. So that's pretty amazing when you look at Walt with that. But Everett Dean, and again, the stats, you can't compare stats because they're totally different eras. You have an era when after a basket was made, we jumped the ball again. You have so it's a completely different era altogether. But Everett Dean was our first All-American, the very first All-American at IU. 7 times Everett Dean outscored the opposing team in a game. He did that 7 times. He could have beat him by himself 7 times. And then, of course, he had a very good 14-year run as head coach, which included our first 3 Big Ten titles. And what he left Branch when he went to Stanford, Branch had some good material for that 1940 NCAA championship. So real close. And Alex, you asked me what I saw as a real trick one. That's it right there.
Wow. I'm surprised to hear you say that, but you stated a good case for it. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens in that bracket for sure. Let's move on.
I think Walt. Excuse me. Jerod. I think Walt will win it hands down.
Yeah.
I don't think it'll even be close. But I'm just stating, as I look at it from a historical perspective, that's where I'm coming from.
Yep. All right, well, let's go into the Bob Knight era, and let's look at the Knight pre-85 era as we go through here. And, there were a couple of pretty close results here in the first round. Obviously, you had Scott May dominating Jim Thomas 98% to 2%, Quinn Buckner dominating Tom Abernathy 96% to 4%. But a couple of the closer ones, in the 7-10 matchup, Steve Downing against Ted Kitchell, Steve Downing won 55% to 45%. Which I was surprised by. Like I guess I just Ted Kitchell with kind of the more recent name recognition. Obviously, he was an announcer for a while. I kind of thought he might win, but Steve Downing wins that one. Did you agree with that result?
Yeah, I totally thought Steve should win that one. I mean, we don't get in the 1973 Final Four without Steve Downing, and again, you're looking at one of the most. Both he and Kitchell had games where they were the most dominant players in that particular game. And you've got Downing in the double overtime victory over Kentucky when he had 47 points. And, of course, Downing against Michigan had the first triple-double and the only triple-double forever until Juwan came along in IU history. And then you have Kitchell against Illinois, who hit on 31 of 33 shots. He was 18 for 18 from the free throw line. 29 of 31 shots. He was 11 for 13 from the field for 40 points. So that was an incredible performance at IU that day against Illinois. But, yeah, I thought Downing just overall was the guy that should move on in that particular one.
Bill, talking to my dad, as you know, he was at IU in the 70s as a student reporter, covered some of those great teams in the mid 70s, and he said on Twitter the other day that, and I honestly I think I agree with him on this, that he really could not believe that Bobby Wilkerson did not move on past Randy Wittman. Your thoughts on that? I mean, I expected it to be a lot closer than 62-38, and I was only born in 1982, so I don't have the vantage point of seeing all these guys play in their primes. I can only go back and listen to people like you and Bob Hamill and other people that have been around the program. But from everything I understand, Bobby Wilkerson was such an important player in those great Indiana teams in the mid-'70s, the undefeated team. Were you surprised by that result? And do you agree with Wittman over Bobby Wilkerson?
Your dad and I have actually tweeted back and forth a little bit on this, actually, because I totally disagree with your dad, and I totally disagree with Wittman. And I'll make my case here, because I was hoping we would get into this one, Alex. I really was, because to me, it was a really close call. If you look at their careers, both of them were on 3 Big Ten championship teams. Both of them were on 1 NCAA championship team. Bobby played on a CCA championship team that only had 2 years of existence. And then Randy played on an NIT in 79 on an NIT championship. So they're very similar in that. Now, what's really interesting is that Bobby, his junior year, played with 6 guys that made the 68 team list that Jerod put together. And Randy's senior year, he played with just 5 players that made the list. And their senior year, Randy played with 3 and Bobby played with 4. So Bobby gets the edge with playing with a little better talent than Randy did at that particular time. Randy was the Big Ten's most valuable player in 1983. Now, here's where I go on. Bobby and Quinn Buckner are the best 2 defensive guards combination we've ever had, bar none. It's not even close. Randy and Isaiah Thomas were 2 of the best offensive guards we ever had, hands down. Bobby only started his junior and senior year. His sophomore year, he came off the bench and he played a little bit on a really good on the best team IU's ever had, in my opinion, and Bob Knight's opinion. Bob Hamill thinks 76, but Knight and I both think 75. Randy started his 4th game into his freshman year and started ever since then. When I was trying to figure this out, I went with Coach Knight, because here's what Coach Knight did and here's what Randy did. In Randy's career at IU, he played more minutes than any other player in the history of IU basketball. Wow. And he played 47 complete 40-minute games. Now, wow. We all know Coach Knight. And if Coach Knight doesn't think you're doing something right, he's going to yank you out. To be able to play 47 complete 40-minute games is pretty amazing. And then the last thing is that turnovers. Randy's freshman year, when he played point guard his freshman year, he was shooting guard after that, but he played point guard his freshman year for the NIT team. He had 73 turnovers for the entire year. That averaged out to a turnover every 17 minutes. His sophomore year, basically 81 became his sophomore year because in 80 he was hurt. His sophomore year in 81, leading the team to the national championship with Isaiah and Ray and Kitchell and Turner, he had 39 turnovers in 35 games. And then what would turn out to be his junior year, he would have 43 turnovers in 27 games. So that was, and in doing that, and your dad was talking about that Bobby was a much better defensive player. He was a better defensive player, and especially athletically, because he had such long arms. We called him Spider-Man. And he was tremendous defensive player. But Randy, in his own right, all the years that he played at IU, he led IU he was second in IU in steals the 4 years that he played. And his defense, while it wasn't the 6'6", and Bobby was 6'7", suffocating defense because of the long arms, one of the things that Randy had was he was tremendously intelligent, which is why he got to play 47 complete games per night, was he played really good position defense. He used his feet extremely well. So I thought it was really close. I love Bobby. I think Bobby was a great, great player. Oh, the one last thing, and I'll get off here, but in '83, when we won the Big Ten title, and Kitchell went down with 3 games to go. And so we had Purdue, Illinois, and Ohio State back to back at home the last 3 games of the season. And we had to win all 3 to win the Big Ten title. And Randy led the way. He had 16 points against Purdue. He had 20 against Illinois and 24 against Ohio State. And we won the Big Ten championship. And I'm still working to try and get that banner placed back up somewhere in Assembly Hall.
Agreed.
Because Knight wanted that banner up because he gave it to the fans, because the fans, I mean, we were in the stands. It was unbelievable, the fan support that team had the last 3 games. So overall, it's real close. I mean, it's really, really close. But I gave it to Randy over Bobby in that situation. And I know your dad was really good friends with Bobby, but Alex, Jerod will tell you, I did the ultimate sacrifice when I voted, and I voted for Bellamy and Dees against Tom and Dick Van Arsdale. And nobody likes Tom and Dick Van Arsdale better than I do.
Yeah.
In fact, I told my son when I voted for Dees over Tom, I knew that somebody born on February 22nd was going to win that contest because they were both born on February 22nd, just several years apart.
Yeah, that would be like me voting against Calvert Chaney. Like, right, I just,
absolutely.
I don't know that I could do it. So the other upset, the other most interesting first round result from this bracket is Ray Tolbert, who was an 11 seed, beating the 6 seed Steve Green, 62% to 38%, which I think further bolsters the case that Steve Green has as being one of the most underrated Hoosiers of all time. He's just consistently underrated for what he meant to those early Bob Knight teams and that transition and building up what became the 75 and 76 teams. Did you agree with this result, or did you have Steve Green over Ray Tolbert?
Well, as you know, I actually had Green over Tolbert. But as I looked at it again and again, I dissect all of this. I understand Ray getting it. Now, Green, again, historically, Green was Knight's first recruit ever. And Green did play on the greatest IU team ever, that 74-75 team. And, I mean, that 74-75 team was dominant. And if May doesn't go down, they're undefeated too. And, in fact, I've heard Quinn say recently even that they should have won even though May went down. And I kind of agree with that. But Ray was the most valuable player in 81. Ray was a tremendous player. He was, besides Wittman and Isaiah, he was the engine that kept that team going.
Wait, he was most valuable player over Isaiah?
Yeah. He was the most valuable player in the Big Ten in 1981.
Oh, wow. I just kind of assumed Isaiah was.
In fact, really interesting, Isaiah was never a Big Ten most valuable player. Because in 80, it was Michael Woodson, which is, again, an amazing thing because he only played six games. And
that is incredible.
Which is incredible. It speaks volumes about what Woodson was. And then you had Tolbert as the most valuable player in 81.
I didn't even realize that. I always just assumed that it was Isaiah.
Well, that's a good, an easy assumption because Isaiah was so good.
Yeah. So as we look at the matchups coming in for the second round, you've got Scott May, the 1 seed, against Randy Wittman. You've got the number 2 seed, Kent Benson, against Steve Downing. The number 3 seed, Isaiah Thomas, against Ray Tolbert. It feels relatively obvious where those are going to go. But then the 4 seed, Quinn Buckner, against the 5 seed, Mike Woodson, which is going to be fascinating because, you mentioned Quinn. I mean, part of the best defensive backcourt in IU history. I mean, the leader on those great Indiana teams. And then you've got Mike Woodson, whose career in a lot of ways was like Calbert Cheney's, to where he was the best player on some really good teams, an incredible scorer. And really, the only reason he doesn't have a banner is more by circumstance than anything he could control, and was just sandwiched in between 2 unbelievable teams. So, I think Quinn will win that. But, I mean, Mike Woodson is, when a lot of people make top 10 lists of the greatest just individual players at IU, he finds his way onto those because he was such a great scorer.
Well, you've got Woodson that in 1980, we win the NCAA title. If Woodson doesn't go down and have surgery and then have to come back, and the latter part of those games, Knight could never take him out because if he took him out, his back stiffened up, so he had to continue to play. And that 1980 team also lost Randy Wittman in the Kentucky game for the rest of the year. So that 80 team very easily could have put a banner up for Woodson. The thing about Buckner is there's only been one player in IU history that started for 4 years and won a Big Ten championship all 4 years, and that was Quinn Buckner. And, Quinn played football his first 2 years at IU also, and his freshman year, the football season ended. 1 week later, the basketball season started, and Quinn left the football team after the last game and walked on the basketball court and was starting as a freshman point guard a week later, which is unbelievable.
That is unbelievable.
Bill, on the next region, the night post 85, and
right,
I think this is a matchup that Jerod is going to hold. I think near and dear to his heart because it's 2 players that he really loves, and I think there's one of these 2 that he likes a little bit more than the other. He may not admit it, but I know he has a soft spot for maybe the underdog here. But Alan Henderson and Greg Graham. And Greg Graham, we had on our podcast. It was, I don't know, the years go by so fast. Maybe it was last spring or the spring before, but he was awesome.
He was.
Loved talking to him. He was obviously a great player. But Alan Henderson, one of the best front court players easily in IU history. Where do you see that argument, and what do you think? Jerod thinks Henderson's going to win easily. I'm not so sure. I think there's a ton of people that love Greg Graham too, and I think that one could be pretty close when it's all said and done.
I think it could be close too, Alex. I think Henderson should win, and I love Greg Graham. I mean, absolutely, he's a great guy. Part of that particular team was really good to my son and daughter when we would go down the games and we would go to now some of you guys might remember this, but the big wheel afterwards, the players would go and eat there, and we would go after the game and eat there, and my son and daughter would get a chance to, go and say hi to him and everything. But Alan was just an incredible player, and Greg was really good too. But Greg was kind of caught up in the log jam of Damon Bailey and Chris Reynolds and Jamal Meeks, all there at guard, and Damon well, did I say Damon already?
Yeah.
But there was a big log jam of guards as far as it was great, and we all watched the 93 team the other night, and I talked about how stacked that team was. Unbelievable. You could have taken the second string from the 92 and 93 teams and had a very good team all on its own. But Henderson was just that big body power forward that was just a special player. And I honestly don't think if Henderson, I don't feel like if Henderson hadn't been hurt, that we would have won another championship. I think then too. I know I keep talking about we would have, but we would have.
No, I firmly agree with that. And that is, look, those are two of the guys that I grew up watching. But I do think Allen should and will win this. He produced more over 4 years. Greg struggled a little bit to kind of get his footing his first couple of years, and then really came on from a production standpoint as a junior. And then, as a senior, what he did, over the last month of the season after Allen got hurt, he was incredible. So, his peak as a player was probably right where Alan Henderson's peak as a player was. We just saw it for a shorter period of time from Greg. And, to be fair, we didn't see what would have happened if Greg had had the chance to carry a team, because he was always there with Calbert, and Allen obviously was there for the next season, scored 23.5 points a game, led that team to the Sweet 16. So we don't know what Greg would have done with that same opportunity. But I think, overall, Allen was the better overall player and produced more. So that'll be an interesting one. And I will also say, Bill, as you were telling those stories about how good those guys were to you, one of my favorite, I think this was from a senior night, their senior night speech in 1993, but one of my favorite moments was when, Greg basically apologized to anybody who asked for an autograph for Calbert Cheaney, thinking he was Calbert Cheaney, because people would always get him confused, and he apologized for signing autographs as Calbert Cheaney because so many people had asked him.
Jared, I've got a good one for you.
Yeah.
When we were at Big Wheel one time, my son, and he was really young at the time, kind of like you guys and everything, he took his program up to Chris Reynolds, and he had gotten Chris Reynolds' page out, and he held up the program, and Chris was just having fun with him. Chris was a great guy too. And he goes, "Oh, that's not me." And he flipped the page over to Pat Graham. He goes, "There I am." And my son, who was taught, my son and daughter were taught to always be polite. He just looked at him in bewilderment, but he didn't say a word. It's just like, "Okay, well, thank you." But it was so funny. We were all laughing.
So a couple other interesting results just from the first round that we can touch on. Keith Smart defeats Jay Edwards. Keith was a 7 seed, Jay the 10 seed, 65% to 35%. That surprised me. Obviously, Jay was the guy who produced better, was the better player, but Keith, obviously was so huge in that run to the 87 title, made the most iconic shot in IU history. So I understand that, even though Jay was my first favorite Indiana player, so it hurt me a little bit to see him go down. But the other one that I did have a problem with, not necessarily the result, but the percentage, was the 8-9 matchup where the 9 seed A.J. Guyton beat the 8 seed Eric Anderson 81% to 19%. And look, A.J. was a great scorer, and was really important to those, teams toward the end of the night era that weren't great, but, still were top 4 or 5 in the Big Ten and made the NCAA tournament. But that seems, and I'm not saying AJ winning isn't reasonable, because it is, but beating Eric, that's just disrespectful to Eric Anderson, who had a much better career, I think, than that vote gives him credit for. Your thoughts on those two results?
Oh, I totally agree with you, Jared. And first of all, Smart, in my opinion, won this poll because of the shot in New Orleans that won the national championship for us. And then he went on and had a really good year the following year too.
Yeah.
And, if Jay Edwards had been playing his whole career against Michigan and Purdue and hitting game-winning shot after game-winning shot at the buzzer.
Which he did.
Which I know. Maybe he goes really far there. But Jay was a tremendous player. He really was. But I think, I can live with the Smart decision. The one I totally agree with you is AJ versus Eric Anderson, because Eric was really, really important to those late 80, early 90 IU teams. He was a tremendous get for Knight out of Illinois. And he came in, and he was gangbusters when he came in.
Yep.
And he even accepted his role of his senior year of being benched and coming off the bench. And you look at the games he had in that tournament, and especially, and I think I've sent you a copy of the UCLA game in 92, didn't I?
Yep.
And you just watch that game, and what Eric did in that game was unbelievable. So, in my mind, it should have been like 55-45.
Yeah, he was most outstanding player of the regional.
Right.
Yeah,
absolutely.
After being benched, I mean that is such a testament to what a team first guy he is and his attitude. He was one of the featured players as a freshman, but really then his great recruiting class after great recruiting class came in after him. He was really able to find his role, especially there at the end. So a testament,
Absolutely.
obviously the late Eric Anderson, but we certainly had to argue his case a little bit there. So before we move on to the post-night bracket, just as we look at these round of 32 matchups, Calvert versus A.J. Guyton, that's a slam dunk. We talked about Allen Henderson, Greg Graham. Steve Alford, Keith Smart, obviously, that'll be a slam dunk in favor of Steve Alford. And then Damon Bailey, Brian Evans, where maybe closer than people think, but I think Damon is pretty clearly going to be the guy there. But people really underrate the senior year that Brian Evans had when he had so much on his shoulders. 20-plus points, 7 rebounds, 4 assists. It's one of the most underrated individual seasons in IU history, I think. He won a Big Ten MVP. So we will see how much people kind of weight that over the legend of Damon Bailey, but also how great of a player he was on some really good Indiana teams. So that's probably the most interesting, well, besides Allen Henderson, Greg Graham, that's the other interesting second-round matchup in the night post-85 region.
Yeah. I think Damon wins that. I think, when you start looking at all the factors, the pressure that Damon had when he came to IU and the 4 years that he was at IU, because Knight had built him up so much before he even arrived there. He's a guy that sold out the Hoosier Dome as a high school senior in a championship game. I mean, it was incredible. But you're right. Brian Evans had a great – I kind of enjoyed the little irony there you said on his shoulders. Brian had a tremendous career and did a great job at IU too. So it should be a little closer than we might think.
Bill, I want to move to the era that I actually know something about, or I don't want to say I don't know anything about the previous regions, but this is the one I'm most comfortable discussing. There's a lot here to unpack, starting with the play-in game that we did between Troy Williams and Romeo Langford, which I was a little surprised that Troy won. I just thought based on name recognition, Romeo would win, and he was obviously here more recently. But kudos to the voters, because in terms of when you look at their accomplishments as a player and what they did in their time in Bloomington, I think Troy deserved to win. It didn't really matter because both of those guys went on. Either one of them was going to go on to lose to Yogi pretty convincingly, and rightfully so. What was your kind of view on Romeo against Troy in that play-in game?
Well, when Jerod and I talked, I had kind of mentioned Romeo's name because I thought he was an important factor for the IU culture, because it was the first time in quite a while we had been able to bring Mr. Basketball from the state of Indiana back on the team. And that was a tremendous get for Archie. It really was. I agree with you that I think Troy, if you look at the span of his 3-year career versus Romeo's 1 year, obviously Troy had a better go of it. The only thing I would say was that I think Romeo played within himself, and there are probably people saying, yes, he played too much within himself, but I think he played more within himself. There were times when Troy would make unbelievable moves, and there are times that, you were like, what are you thinking, Troy? And I like Troy, but my nickname for Troy was Scarecrow, because I said, if he only had a brain on the court, and that sounds like I'm really bad-mouthing Troy, and I'm not. It's just the way he played.
I will say, I agree with you, Alex. Kudos to the voters on this one. I think it reflects a little bit more mature understanding of Troy's career, which was so up and down, and good Troy, bad Troy. Like, every reaction was extreme because so many of his performances were extreme. But, he was, I think, an underrated Troy Williams moment to where, his just fearlessness, which was his greatest strength and his greatest weakness, came in huge, was in 2016 when that team was really, really struggling. They had struggled in Maui. They just and there had obviously been a lot of hype heading into the season, and nothing's going right for them. And they're down. What were they down at halftime of the Crossroads Classic to Notre Dame? Like 10, 12 points, something like that. Notre Dame comes out and scores the first couple buckets to go up 15-16.
I think they were down 16 in the second half. 16
yeah,
at least.
And it, like, in the moment watching that game, it really felt like the season was hanging in the balance, because it's like, man, are we going to go out like this to Notre Dame? And, I mean, the resume to that point was nothing. And he just totally took over the game and just started driving to the basket, got Indiana going. And there were several performances like that he had where nothing's happening. And, hey, Troy is fearless. He's going to go attack, and everybody kind of fed off of it. And so, obviously, look, that guy had so much athletic ability, so much talent. You could say that maybe he should have been higher than a play-in game if he could have harnessed it all. But I'm glad that he ended up making this field, because I definitely think in the post-night era, he's, one of the 16 best players. And I think, it'll be interesting. I think people reflect more fondly on his time at IU now than they did maybe going through it. And I think we might see something similar for Devontae. Now, he wasn't the player Troy was. His teams didn't have that level of success. But I think as we get more further removed from it, people will reflect more on those kind of good times and think a little bit less about some of the bad times. But
I agree with you, Jerod, on that. And just to piggyback on Troy 1 second, then I'll let Alex go. But just look at the Kentucky game in the Sweet 16.
Yeah.
He comes in and he took a couple of horrendous shots, but it did not alter him at all. He came right back and made a couple of acrobatic, tremendous makes.
Yeah.
And I agree with you. I thought that Kentucky game, he just kind of made the team think, we're going at these guys. I don't care what they think. We're going to beat these guys. And I thought Troy was a big part of that.
Yep.
Yeah, you watched that game, and I did watch it the other day because it was on. I don't know what channel it was on. It was maybe one of the Big Ten Network replays that they've been doing. Those are awesome. It's like an hour, and the game is completely condensed. There's no timeouts. It's just like, all right, we're gonna speed through this as quickly as possible. But they're great to sit down and watch for an hour. But you're right, Troy in that game. If you watch that game, and Kentucky had Jamal Murray, who's a pretty darn good NBA player right now. And there's some other talented players on that Kentucky team. Tyler Ulis was really good. But Troy was making a ton of plays at the rim with the athletic ability that you just don't like. You watch Indiana this past year and you say there's not a guy that can just go get a bucket. Troy Williams could go get a bucket. And the other day, there's not a lot to do right now. And my 9-year-old son, he loves watching basketball. And I went on YouTube and I found Troy Williams' high school mixtape and I played it for him. And his jaw, I had to help him get it off the floor, because the guy was an unbelievable talent from just an athletic and dunking perspective. He's a ton of fun to watch. Yes, he might have been one of the most frustrating guys to watch for fans, because some of the stuff he did was just head scratching, and you wondered, Troy, just take it down to about 95% and instead of 110, and maybe you make that play. You're not as out of control. But the other thing about Troy Williams is, I remember the story, and I don't know if either one of you remember this, but when Justin Albers wrote for us, there was a story he wrote about Troy Williams when he was coming out of high school, talking about his background and his kind of his upbringing and kind of the challenges he went through. He's a guy that, for me, it was just hard not to root for him. Like, I wanted him to do well, not just because he was such a talent, but just because of some of the challenges that he overcame in his life. And I hate to see I talk to Jerod a lot about this, is like, the more we can humanize these guys as people and not just focus on what they do on the court, I think that the more connected that people feel with these players. And some of them have overcome some really tough circumstances to get where they are in life. And I think Troy Williams is a guy that Indiana fans should be proud that he came to their school and represented them, because I think, for the most part, he represented IU in a first-class way.
And I totally agree with you, Alex. And in fact, when I gave you that nickname, I wasn't degrading him at all on that. It was just kind of, sometimes I just nickname players as to traits that I see. But I totally agree with you that, and I would venture to say that Troy probably has had more athletic ability. You probably have to go with Vic as the only two players in the post-Knight era that have had the athletic ability that Troy had.
Yeah. Yeah, you can maybe toss OG in there and possibly Eric Gordon, but that was a different kind of athletic ability that those guys had.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so in the first round matchup, Yogi Ferrell did beat Troy Williams 99% to 1%, which is what we all expected, but I'm glad that we were able to have that conversation about Troy. That's why I love doing this, because it brings out some of those conversations that I think are really good to have. Some close results here. I was surprised that DJ White, the 5 seed, beat AJ Moye 66% to 34%. Not because DJ White wasn't a great player. He is another underrated guy. But I thought the legend of AJ Moye might get him a little bit closer. But I think that's probably what that voting should have been. But two really close matchups. The 6 seed Tom Coverdale beats the 11 seed Juwan Morgan 52% to 48%. I was surprised there because I thought recency bias might lead Juwan Morgan to win that. And then Jordan Hulls, the 10 seed, upsets the number 7 seed Eric Gordon 54% to 46%. Probably the one that I saw the most discussion about. And again, this is where, what is your criteria? Because Eric Gordon, one of the best freshman seasons, really one of the best individual seasons that we've seen at IU his freshman year, in a very tumultuous season. And we don't know what would have happened if that season had gotten to end normally, because there was a time in February where that looked like a possible 1 seed and maybe a team that could win it all. But we never got to see that because the bottom fell out of the season. But clearly the better player has had a great NBA career and has been very supportive of the program, since he's left. But then going up against Jordan Hulls, the guy that is like Mr. Hoosier from Bloomington, started so many games, a 4-year starter, a great shooter, and had a lot of achievements in his own right, but was never the individual player Eric Gordon was. So those two results really stood out to me. Where did you stand on those?
Well, I thought it was simply a matter. You stated very well. I thought it was simply a matter that Jordy was there for 4 years and had a more successful run in that time period, making it to 2 Sweet 16s. I think that's where it all boils down to, because obviously Eric Gordon, as a player, was a better player than Jordy Hulls.
Yep. And what about Coverdale Morgan?
Oh, that was really a good one. I thought that Morgan might win, just like you said, because of being there recently, and the fact that I think Jared Jeffries on that team sometimes overshadows Coverdale a little bit, but people probably remember Coverdale's toughness playing through the injury in that tourney run that he did. That was really important too. So I agree with Coverdale winning, but I was not surprised at how close it was.
Mm-hmm.
So, Bill, if you had to handicap this whole thing the rest of the way, it's going to play out over the next couple of weeks, and we're talking about who goes on to win this. Who in your mind are the 3 to 4 names that you feel like have the best chance to win? I'm, the night pre-85. Go ahead. The night pre-85 to me is going to be really interesting, because I feel like there's a ton of names on there that have a chance to get to the Final Four.
As a loaded region.
It's going to be interesting. Who, if you had to give 3 or 4 names, who do you think are the most likely to win?
I'll tell you my Final Four on the one side of the bracket are Schlunt and Dees versus Buckner and Isaiah. And that's leaving out.
You have Buckner beating May.
That's meeting. That is having Buckner beat May, and I could stand here right now and make a huge argument for May being the all-time great player. So
do you have to have May go out in the Elite Eight? Like that just kind of hurts, I
know I'm just telling you what I have.
No, I know.
You cannot.
It's hard.
A statistical value on what Quinn Buckner did for 4 years at IU.
Yeah.
To come in a week after playing football, and he was a really good football player. Your dad would tell you that.
Yep.
To come in and walk on the basketball court and start at point guard a week later, to be a starter on that Final Four team in 73, to win the CCA and Big Ten in 74, to be on the greatest team in 75 with that team, and then to be the captain of that team in 76 that won it all. I mean, it was just tremendous. And May had a tremendous year, career too. And his junior and senior year, probably nobody's had any better. So it's a tough call. But I have Schlunt versus Dees and Buckner versus Isaiah. And then on the other side, and you're happy with this, Jerod, I know you've seen my poll all the way through, Calbert versus Steve, and Calbert wins that, and Vic versus Yogi, and I've got Vic winning that.
I think for the post-Knight era, it was pretty easy to pick the top four with Yogi, Jared Jeffries, Cody Zeller, and Victor Oladipo, so I'm going to be shocked if it's not all four of those guys moving on. I do think it'll end up being Calbert and Steve Alford. I mean, those seem like the obvious picks to go there. I think that's going to be one of the more interesting debates. And I've gotten into this debate with people a lot over the years, between Calbert and Steve, because obviously, look, Steve was incredible. He only had the 1 year with the three-point line. He shot like 55%. So if you extrapolate what he could have done, over the previous 3 years, if he would have had that, obviously his scoring totals would have been higher. Won a few Big Ten championships, wins the national championship. And that's always the thing that gets held as kind of the trump card for people who argue Alford over Chaney. Are basically those two things, because there's Chaney fans obviously will argue that he's the all-time leading scorer, Big Ten's all-time leading scorer, but then it's okay, but what would Alford have done with the three-point line? And Alford won the national championship. So why do you argue Calbert over Steve Alford?
Okay, well, Calbert won more Big Ten titles than Steve. Steve only won a Big Ten title, and it was a shared title his senior year because he.
Was that the only one? He didn't win two?
Yeah.
I guess you're right.
Yeah, he just won one because he and Darryl.
I guess that's true.
And Todd Meyer were looking straight in the eye. If Michigan doesn't beat Purdue in that final game, then they're looking at a 4-year career in which they don't win a Big Ten championship and become Knight's only 4-year team not to do so, or 4-year recruiting class not to do so. So you've got Calbert, who won a couple, and that was including when you had some really good teams like Michigan, the Fab Five, and you had Jackson at Ohio State. I mean, there was some really good competition.
Iowa was really good back then.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So I think the fact that Calbert was able to do what he did on a nightly basis, and just, well, we all saw the other night, we watched the Louisville game again, and you saw what he did to Morton and you saw what he did to Louisville.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's just, Calbert was special, and he was, and I'm not saying Steve wasn't special, because Steve was too. They were both, and I know both of them. And I just have to go with Calbert. I do, and I know that makes you happy, Jerod.
I agree with you. I agree.
Bill, one thing I said to Jerod to watch for is that Damon Bailey Steve Alford match. For some reason, I get the feeling, and not that I would agree with this. I think Bailey is going to have a shot against Steve Alford, and I'm not saying it based on what they accomplished as players. I'm saying some of the things about Steve Alford in his recent past in terms of coaching and some of the things that have happened there. I think that could have some impact on voting. I'm not saying it should, but I think there's a chance that Damon Bailey could challenge Alford. Your thoughts on that?
I think you're exactly right, Alex. I really do, because when the people do the voting, they don't put themselves in a vacuum and just go one of the things I try to do, and Jerod knows this all too well, talking to me a number of times, I try and put myself back in that time frame. And I think if you put yourself in the time frame that Damon played and the time frame that Steve played and what they were able to do and accomplish, I think Steve wins. But I agree with everything you're saying about all of the recent history is still going to be there too. And I think that could pull the voting a little bit toward Damon a little bit too. I think Steve wins, but I think it'll be a lot closer than some people might assume.
Yep. Hey, last question for you on the bracket, just because I wanted to make sure that you mentioned it before we get out of here. In that post-night era, the other first-round matchup result that was kind of surprising was the 9-seed Christian Watford defeating the 8-seed Jeff Newton, 84% to 16%. Again, the result itself doesn't surprise me, nor do I think it's wrong, but the gulf between the two, again, maybe just some recency bias. Christian Watford was great, but I just think it shows people underrating what Jeff Newton did and was over his career.
And I would agree with that. But I just think, again, I think you're looking at different times.
Yeah.
And, another thing that's going to go into it, whether you like it or not, and I don't particularly like it, but, Mike Davis was not the most popular coach that IU had, even when we were being successful, because there were people that thought he was over his head, people that thought, we're not happy that Knight had been fired. And so, and when Watford was playing his last 2 years, when he was playing Sweet 16 both times, Tom Crean was really loved at that particular time because we had come out of the worst time period in IU's history as a record, as a program. I think that plays into it a little bit too.
Yep. Well, this was a fun conversation, Bill. It's been really fun to see the bracket, kind of see the voting take shape. There's a part of me that would like to go back and start this over and rig the seating a little bit better so that Jay Edwards and Bill Garrett were moving on to the second round. But we will have to live with the results. Yes.
Can I ask both of you a question? Because as I was going through this, and my son and I were going through it last night, as you look at all the players in the four brackets, does it kind of explain why we haven't been as good in the last so many years when you look at the players that were in the post-night bracket versus the other three brackets? Would you guys agree with that, or am I just being harsh?
Yes. No, I experienced that when I was doing it. It was a lot harder to figure out. It was really hard to figure out the back end of the post-night era just because there were a dearth of players that felt really deserving of being in, because the other brackets were just so stacked with guys and the top of the bracket and even all the way down through the end. So, yeah, I mean, look, at the end of the day, it's a player's game. Now, obviously, some of that is that, some of these players got to play under Bob Knight, got to play under Branch McCracken, who are two of the most successful coaches in Big Ten history. So that probably explains some of their success and some of their player development. But we just haven't had a lot of consistency and a lot of, superstar guys that have stayed long enough in the post-night era. Because that's the other difference. If Eric Gordon stays longer, if Jared Jeffries stays longer, which they might have in an earlier era, if Victor Oladipo stays for a senior year, now maybe some of those teams are better and, we're viewing this a little bit differently, but it's been a different era. And to me, it was really obvious making the bracket that was the case.
I just wondered if I was the only person looking at it that way or if you guys felt that way also.
No, I definitely did. And look, hopefully Trace Jackson Davis is a guy that is on this list, someday with another, terrific season as a sophomore. He's a guy who probably would have been on here. We just didn't, put current players on there, but it'll be fun. So, if you're enjoying this project, make sure that you check InsideTheHall.com. Alex, those posts will start going up again on Monday for the second round voting.
Correct. Start Monday.
Okay, so that'll be there. Obviously, follow us on Twitter at Inside the Hall, at Assembly Call. And Bill, where's the best place for people to connect with you online?
Well, they can follow me on Twitter. I'm William Indiana 2.
Yep.
And then I also, I've got my third in the series of 5 articles on our championship teams came out, the 76 team, and I'm actually going to be doing a podcast with Ben and Robbie and Kathy tomorrow on that particular team.
Over at HoosiersUnited.com. That's where those articles are.
HoosiersUnited.com, yeah. So,
yep.
I thank you both for allowing me to be in there with you guys today. It's a whole bunch of fun. I've been looking forward to this since you invited me. I've been looking forward to this. So
absolutely. No, we appreciate you being here. Your insight is always appreciated. I always enjoy my opportunities to talk IU basketball with you because, I always picture you with the amount of detail that you give on these games and players that you just have like rapid fire internet research abilities and you're reading this, but all of this is off the top of your head.
Because I'm speaking to you on my phone, and I write my books on yellow legal pads, so savvy at all.
It's incredible. Well, Bill, thank you very much, and for everybody listening, thank you, and check out Inside the Hall this week and vote in the round of 32 and beyond. It'll be fun to see how this shakes out.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it, Bill.
Thank you, Alex.
Talk to you all next week.
Jared.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Podcast on the Brink. We always appreciate you being here. Remember to join me and my co-hosts for more IU basketball talk at assemblycall.com and visit Alex over at insidethehall.com for complete coverage of Indiana basketball. If you want to support Podcast on the Brink, here is the single best way to do it. Tell anyone you know who loves IU hoops about us and suggest that they subscribe. Podcast on the Brink can be found on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Tell your social media followers, email your friends, text your family members. For weekly discussion about IU basketball, they need to be subscribed to Podcast on the Brink. We'll talk to you next time. Go Hoosiers.